I'm the head of the Secretariat for the Legal and Justice Affairs Advisory Council. This advisory council was established by the Ethiopian government to advise it on reforming the Ethiopian legal system so that it's compliant with the human rights and democratic standards established by the Constitution and by international legal standards and human rights standards. My perspective on the legal reform agenda is that it was long overdue. I'm a human rights lawyer, so I've been following Ethiopian human rights law for quite a while, and in the last 20 years, Ethiopia had been making progress towards democratization and towards reforming its institutions so that it's human rights compliant. And in 2005, it came to a point where the government, for different reasons, including the fact that it lost elections, decided to reverse this process of democratization. And it started putting into its legislation authoritarian thoughts and systems and moving away from a system of human rights and democracy and respect for the rule of law. And that inevitably meant that it had to use force in order to rule the country. And that process came to a head 5 years ago, where a protest movement started that was fed up with the authoritarian policies and practices of torture, of arresting massive numbers of people. And after 4 years of protest, it was about time that the government realized that it needed to reverse course. So that reversal back to coming to a system of democratization and the rule of law and constitutionalism. The underlying theme of the entirety of the project, the entirety of the work of the Legal and Justice Affairs Advisory Council is that how does Ethiopia become a democratic state? What legislative and institutional reform does it need to undertake in order to be able to democratize? So democracy is one aspect. Second aspect is to make Ethiopia's legislation human rights compliant, based on standards of the Constitution, the African human rights system standards, and global human rights standards. And the third one focuses on the rule of law. So how do you ensure Ethiopia becomes a country that respects the rule of law and constitutionalism? One of the challenges has been to push through this reform with a volunteer force, which can sometimes struggle in meeting deadlines and so on. The other challenge that we were facing as technicians, as legal experts, is that when transitions happen, usually there is some clear directionality in terms of, especially when the transition is completed, there's a sense of directionality in which the country is going as a whole. And in the Ethiopian context, there has been change, there has been a transition process that started, and the legal reform process is clear in as much as the direction is going in towards democratization, towards human rights. But a number of legal constitutional debates are still ongoing in the country, which make it unclear as to what way the whole country is going. What are the big and detailed policy frameworks towards which the country is moving. And the fact that that big picture doesn't exist, the fact that you have had massive human rights violations in Ethiopia. And when you're reforming the legislation, one of the questions you'd inevitably ask is, what transitional justice mechanisms are you going to use? And so these types of, there are many things that haven't been settled. And in that unsettled context, the legal reform, sometimes it's not clear if if just the legal reform was going in a certain direction and the whole country is going with it or not, or which direction is it, going. So in that term, as lawyers, we have once in a while faced a challenge with bigger constitutional, institutional questions of reform. And the other, maybe last challenge we have faced and we do expect to face is that all the laws that I just listed involve laws that are going to severely restrict the power of government, and especially the power of individuals in governments, from the top to the bottom level. And when you're taking power, and when I say power away from government, I'm talking about things like criminal procedure legislation that's human rights compliant, or anti-terrorism legislation that's human rights compliant. In a context where people have been violating human rights, you're now telling them that they can't do certain things, that they don't have certain powers. And a really good example is the administrative legislation, administrative procedure legislation, which is going to ask every government office to do more things to accommodate the requests of their clients, the public, and also make themselves accountable and write down every decision, appeal procedures, and once in a while, individuals will be able to go to court and sue the government and force them to do things that they would otherwise not like to do, and things that they didn't do in the past. So access to information is another example where there are zero access to information requests in Ethiopia that are being complied with. And now you're asking every government institution to provide information when asked. So, these things there will be pushback from thousands of government employees, of security officers, who will be losing power they used to exercise. And so that will be a challenge that the Ethiopian public and the Ethiopian government will have to face, and will have to take measures to make sure that these laws are complied with. Well, what I hope to see is an Ethiopia in which Ethiopians in general, but Ethiopian journalists and politicians aren't arrested or tortured or detained for long periods of time just because they disagree with those in power. An Ethiopia in which lawyers such as myself aren't told they're suspects of terrorism or whatever crime their clients are accused of because they put up a stiff legal resistance. An Ethiopia in which minority ethnic groups aren't persecuted or massacred, and those are things that happened in the past. An Ethiopia in which indigenous communities aren't kicked out of their ancestral lands because the government decided that they want to sell the minerals under their feet. And the reason I think all these things are important and will not happen under under the reformed Ethiopia is that the legal reforms should be able to establish a system in which the basic rights of citizens, of minorities, of peoples are respected, and a country in which the rule of law is respected, where you can go to the judiciary when you have disagreements with the government and enforce your rights. And so that's the type of Ethiopia I hope will come out of this in this reform process.